We are going to look a little bit today on the subject of the tribe of Dan. And I'm going to tell you in advance, because this is such a massive subject, there's no way that I could present the full scope of Dan in 1 hour. It's impossible. And I want to give you details that become important, not things, I'm not interested in dates for the sake of dates. I'm not interested in lands for the sake of lands. I'm interested in giving you real hardcore facts that will be able to put so many pieces together that when we're done, you can clearly see this is nothing else but God's hand in the flow of history, and there is no denying that. So we've already looked slightly at Dan as a son of Jacob, Israel. We know Dan, at the time of the Exodus, numbered 62,700. That is fighting men who are of the age to fight. That does not include women, children, and perhaps the elderly. And this number is only second to the tribe of Judah, which numbered 74,600. So you can see there, tribe of Dan, 62,700. Judah, 74,600. So Judah was the most populous. And this becomes an issue for many people, which I hope to explain. But Dan was the standard bearer for what is the second largest camping number, in total of 157,600, if you compare that to Judah's camp of 186,400. So we're talking about big numbers within the camp. We know that Dan was the rear guard and second in line of command. We also know, as I've already explained in previous messages, because of Dan's location, specifically the coastal dwellers, they had close ties, and we know this. They intermarried with various groups. The Bible even says this. We see them with Philistines. We see them with Phoenicians. I don't think they had any limitation on who they mingled with, but specifically they had no problem mingling with their non-tribe of Israel neighbors, all right? Now, we know from the biblical account that Reuben, who should have been in the first place, forfeited his place because the Bible says he defiled his father's bed. We know that Simeon and Levi, who would be the next in line, they had, we'll call them anger issues, okay? And if you don't know about them, you can read it in your own time. So basically, they lost their place. That puts Judah in the, we'll call it number one son. The law of primogeniture basically is the firstborn, but it put Judah into that first place and put Dan into the second place. So what do we know about Dan? And there are several things that are said. One of them, something so it leaps out at you, because we have this common nomenclature of the tribes of Israel, but right there, Genesis 49:16, Dan shall judge his people as one of the tribes of Israel. That's just baffling. Now, many people have said there is potential that the verbiage tribes of Israel was added later. We'll investigate that when we do a translation, but I just want you to look at that. Next, what is said of Dan? I want you to take a look. In 17, Dan shall be a serpent by the way, an adder in the path that biteth the horse heels, so that his rider shall fall backward. And something strange that comes after it. I have waited for thy salvation, O Lord. And there's much debate over how, again, this should be understood. But there's one thing in here that's kind of strange, and that is the Hebrew word for what is a horned viper. And it could also entail a sidewinder. That describes the path, perhaps, that Dan took as he traversed leaving the Levant, traversing the Mediterranean, ultimately ending up in the far-flung corners of the earth. Yes, absolutely. But there may be another implication that we'll pick up a little bit later regarding the horns, and it's not about Satan, so don't even go there. All right. Now, let me show you something that is equally interesting. Before I turn away from this, because I don't want to go back and forth, I want you to look at verse 9 and see what is said of Judah. It says, Judah is a lion's whelp. You read that, right? Okay, if you turn with me to Deuteronomy 33 and verse 22, it says of Dan, Dan is a lion's whelp. I am going to show you something really kind of interesting. Now, it's said of both of them, except in this particular verse, there's something else that said, he shall leap from Bashan. Let me show you something. And I will try and do this logically. Sometimes it's really hard to explain something right in the middle of something else because you can lose everything that I'm trying to do. But let me try and show you this. Forgive me, this is a National Geographic map. And if you look carefully, here is Bashan right here, but also Bashan can be synonymous with Mount Hermon. They are in the general area. And what's interesting is you can see it says here East Manasseh, even though Tel Dan is there. So what does that mean? Well, let me give you a few weird ideas. Because in many instances, Bashan, as I said, is sometimes referred to as Mount Hermon. And when they excavated Mount Hermon, they found over 20 plus temples. And they were strange temples. They were not the normal type of temples that one would think of finding. And there is an idea there, when I say this, maybe for some it will connect the dots. Hermon has been interpreted by some to mean he of the stone heap. And this will connect us with all of those stones, those large megaliths, potentially, that we find elsewhere littered across the earth. It may be from this Genesis, from this area, that we begin to understand what on earth are those stones for. So I'm just putting that in there. These are pieces of information we have to revisit when we get further enough along to be able to talk about this, which we're not there yet. So the other thing that we do know about Dan is from the passage, do not turn there, in Judges. While there is a battle raging, it is asked, why is Dan remaining in ships? And there's a lot of hypothesis here, whether Dan was uninterested in getting involved in bloodshed and warfare with his brethren, or whether they were preoccupied with their seafaring and about to take off and depart, which I tend to lean towards they were actually departing at that time, because the timeline is very close to, we can follow the trail of these people as they take off, and where they appear again, the timeline is pretty good to assess that way. Now, this is a lot to take in at one time, so let me just say to you, there's a connection. Obviously, Dan and Judah are sons of Jacob, who becomes Israel. But we're going to see a connection that is unmistakable as we start tracing the steps. And I'm not suggesting, by the way, that they are homogenized. There's just something very peculiar I want you to note as we go. So again, hold that thought. All right, the next thing we know about these people is a passage we already looked at in Judges 18. And this is something I'd really like for you to consider what this might mean as well. We know the story that occurs in Judges 18 about the 30th verse of the 18th chapter of Judges. And the children of Dan set up the graven image. And Jonathan, the son of Gershon, the son of Manasseh, that is Moses' grandchildren. He and his sons were priests of the tribe of Dan until the day of captivity, the captivity of the land. And they set up them Micah's graven image, which he made all the time that the house of God was in Shiloh. That tells you something. If you go back and you look at this passage, it is very clear that they did not do away with idol worship. And in fact, they, forgive the term, they sucked in those priests into false worship and kept it going. They didn't go back. If you read it carefully, and it says, until the day of captivity, until the captivity of the land. So that is a very important point, and I'll tell you why. It says that the descendants, these priests, participated in the perpetuating of false idol worship. Don't just think, oh, they did it at Dan and Dan was responsible. They sucked other people into that. Just think about that, and the ramifications of that are pretty big. So we've got the reference there, and I don't think I have enough time. I'm worried to take the time to read the passage. So at your own leisure, please go back and read Judges 18 all the way through. It might make more sense to you after I'm done anyway. But that gives you insight. Now, people have said over and over again, and I may be repeating this, that the reason why Dan is not included in the 144,000 of the book of Revelation is because they engaged in idolatry, and their whole camp, everyone around them, engaged in this. Well, I hate to tell you, they all did. If you think about it, what was the act? I mentioned this before. What was the act of the golden calf? They all participated. They all put their gold in and said, build us a god that we might worship. They're all guilty. So you can't just make it that they may have been the most egregious, but we're going to find all these people are guilty of that. So I don't think you can make that the criteria. So let's just park that thought for a second. Now, here's what I want to tie together, and I want to show you something of a strange parallel between Dan and Judah. So turn with me to Exodus. We're looking at some strange passages, and I just want you to see maybe what I see. And I don't think it's an error here. So beginning, for example, in Exodus 31, we have the mention of God appointing the builders to build the tabernacle. And the Lord spake unto Moses, saying, See, I have called up by name Bezaleel, the son of Uri, the son of Hur, of the tribe of Judah, and have filled him with the Spirit of God and wisdom and understanding and knowledge and all the manner of workmanship to devise cunning works, work in gold, silver, brass, cutting of stone, to set them, the carving of timber, to work in all manner of workmanship. And behold, I have given with him Aholiab, the son of Ahisamach, of the tribe of Dan. And in the hearts of all that are wise-hearted, I have put wisdom, that they may make all that I have commanded thee. So it's very interesting. You have one of Judah and one of Dan that are working side by side. And you say, okay, that's no big deal. But you'll read it again. There's another reference in Exodus 35, verses 30 through 35. There's another reference in Exodus 36. And there's another reference to the same thing in Exodus 38, verses 22 through 23. Why do I say this is interesting? You'll see towards the end of the message, kind of giving you a spoiler alert, that Dan will land somewhere and Judah will follow. They won't know necessarily who they are, but they'll once more be in that same realm together. So keep in mind, I don't think this is an error. There's something more to this parallel as we see these two tribes kind of working side by side to build the tabernacle for worship. We will kind of see these two tribes side by side, although we know the tribe of Judah is the tribe that to whom the scepter was given, the right to rule and law. Kings will come out of that line. But we will equally see Dan doing a parallel thing, but they will be trailing each other. And as we trace them, this is what I'm going to point out today. We must keep them separate and distinct. There's been way too much confusion about who's who. And I'm going to keep repeating this part until you're sick of hearing it, because there's so much error out there on this. It drives me crazy when I read people who conflate these similar names or similar people, but they are distinct. So just put that in your pocket somewhere and deal with it. All right, by the time you get to 1 Samuel 13:19, it says, there was no smith found throughout the land of Israel. And that is significant. That tells you that all the people who were artificers of iron, brass, of metal workers were now nowhere to be found. Now we know that maybe Judah received skill in building the tabernacle, but it was Dan who we know from their exploits had the skills in dealing and working, mining and molding and making metal objects. We know that for a fact. We know that by the time Solomon is building the temple, we have craftsmen that will herald from the tribe of Naphtali and other places. So it's very clear that at a certain time, some of these people who actually have these skills will be gone. And that's no accident either. When we read, for example, about those idols that were set up at Dan and Bethel, I have good speculation that the tribe of Dan probably participated in making those idols. That's a very plausible thought. We read nothing about Jeroboam asking for additional foreign help. So it kind of sounds like, yeah, there's the potential that they could have aided and abetted that whole downward spiral of worship. Now, as I said, Dan is not mentioned specifically in any realm of deportation except for that passage we just looked at in Judges 18:30, where it says, until the day of captivity. So there is good reason to believe that a trace of Dan, perhaps the inland dwellers, may have been carried away and did not go overland or oversea, but stayed with the house of Israel. There is a possibility. So now, last but not least, because I'm setting the stage to look at everything Dan before we step outside the pages of the Bible, I'd like you to turn with me to Genesis 46 and verse 25. As we're setting all this foundation for Dan, you can flip back and forth. You can make a note of the children as they are being born, the record of children being born to Jacob. You find that in Genesis 29 and 30. Now, what's interesting is we know that the handmaid of Rachel, because Rachel could not conceive, we know that the handmaid of Rachel conceived, and we have the record basically of Bilhah, and it says she conceived and bare a son, and Rachel names the child Dan, so that child came out of the handmaid, not Rachel herself. Bilhah's conceived again, and Naphtali is produced. Now that's the record we have of those children coming out of, forgive me, her loins, his loins, I don't know what's appropriate to say there, all right? But when you read in Genesis 46:25, it says, these are the sons of Bilhah, which Laban gave unto Rachel his daughter, and she bare these unto Jacob, and all the souls were 7. Now this is important, and I'll tell you why. Usually when we talk about generations, we can talk about the offspring of the offspring of the offspring. This is not that. If you read carefully, it is specific. So there are children that were born unto her that are not, we don't have their names. And I'm going to tell you the very good possibility of the reason why we don't have their names. They were daughters. They were girls. And there's only one girl out of all of the children of the tribes that is mentioned, and that's Dinah. So why is this important? Because if you keep reading, you'll see that we have the mention, for example, of, I think it says here, see, the sons of Leah, which she bare unto Jacob in Padamaran, and his daughter Dinah, and all the souls of his sons and daughters were 33. But you don't read that in the record in Genesis 30. Do you understand what I'm trying to say? So there's good reason when you look at this, don't go, this may be successive generations. These are children that the likelihood they are daughters is very strong, or that these were born at a much later date because they lived longer. Who knows? But I'm leaning heavily on the fact, if you read all the genealogies, except for the genealogies that are recorded in the New Testament to show the lineage either from Adam to Christ, which includes women, but the records were done distinctly to show male children and heirs, all right, to establish the pattern. So why am I pointing this out? The reason is very simple. If you're looking at the record here in Genesis 46, and you're looking at all of these records, I want you to zone in on verse 23. And the sons of Dan, one name, Hushim, singular. Now you tell me, because I just told you that the tribe of Dan was second in number to Judah and its mass population. You tell me that one son can produce a tribe. I agree with you over there. So what am I telling you? I'm telling you that the likelihood that the tribe of Dan produced one son and only daughters is very great. That's the only way that that tribe could become as popular. So if you think about it, a woman can pop out many babies, right? In that day, to have 8 or 10 children and then you die, no big deal. That's how they became so populous. There are a lot of people say, well, this is because they had no memory at a later time. No. And the reason why I am going to bet all the money on the farm here on this, remember I told you, within antiquity and mythological records, you will always find a kernel of truth, and you must look to all of these sources and sift out what is imagination and what is truth. We have the record within Greek mythology and some of the ancient records that tell us about the flight of Danis with his 50 daughters out of Egypt to Greece. Now, did they have 50 daughters? I'll tell you what I believe this is. I believe this was a culmination of mostly women. Don't think about 50 daughters born to one man. Think about daughters of daughters of daughters. And there could be credence to this. There could be a possibility that nestled into this mythological tale is the truth of the tribe of Dan, which I lean heavily on because I'll always tell you when it's opinion or speculation, this is my opinion. There is no way that one singular man produced those numbers for the tribe as they counted the people, which tells me, and they didn't have a record, as I said, only Dinah is recorded here, and there's this scant reference to all the souls of his sons and daughters, but other than that, and that's for another tribe, we don't read of women being chronicled. Women were not seen, I'm sorry, but this is the age that this took place in. So it was for men, the chronicle of the genealogies representing men. That's why I said to you, think carefully now. And so this is an important place to start filling out some blanks, because when you ask people, specifically Greek people, where they came from, they themselves don't have an answer. Unless, of course, you're an avid reader to not just peruse history, and history has a terminus. You can only go so far back, and then especially in Greek history, it just becomes a lot of tales and mythology, and it's homogenized. You keep looking, you will find the kernel of truth on which it is based. So, jumping to another revelation. You remember I talked to you about the sea people being referenced in the Egyptian inscription, Pharaoh's mortuary stone that referred to a people called the Denyen, or the Danuna, or the Danuni. Do you think it's possible that the Denyen, the Danuna, the Danuni of the Egyptians, and the people that are called Danis, Danoi, or Danin by the Egyptians, and the reference to the tribe of Dan are just mere coincidences, or are these one and the same people? One has to take a look at that, stop, and realize again, this requires an analysis of things. You can't just say, well, it looks all the same, but we can see from the characteristics the Denyen people were sea. They were not the only sea peoples, but they were sea people, and they were warriors wanting basically to pick the fight with the Egyptians. Now, you think about this. They weren't singular. We have good reason to believe that there were other tribes involved, but it's really logical if you think about it, that they would participate in an attack, an attempt to attack the Egyptians, who in their mind perhaps were the oppressors of their people in their own record. Now, whether or not that is so, I'm telling you, I don't think it's a mere coincidence. So, let's put that to the side. Last but not least, before we go on the trail of Dan, I have to make this clear. How many of you have books on the lost tribes or articles or things you've read? Show me your hands. Okay. How many of you have been totally confused about the names of people that sound the same and you can't figure out is, for example, the Bible mentions a person named Darda or Dara. And how many times have you tried to read and you see maybe they're mixing this with somebody named Dan or Dan names, and they're just doing this. So let me set the record straight, please. This is something that has been driving me crazy. From some of the most famed contributors on this subject, I see this error. The tribe of Dan will be known and referred to by the Greeks, Danoi, Danan, Danos. There's another person we looked at that is from the tribe of Judah. In 1 Chronicles, we read, let's go there so everybody can see it. I'd like to make sure everybody's on the same page, no pun intended. Okay, save that one for later. 1 Chronicles, 2nd chapter, and if you start at the 3rd verse, when it says, and the sons of Judah, and you keep reading down, because this is all the line of Judah, and the sons of Zerah. Remember I said the twins, Zerah and Phares, right? Tamar, his daughter-in-law, bare him Phares and Zerah, and the sons of Judah were 5. The sons of Phares, Hezron and Hamul. The sons of Zerah, Zimri, Ethan, Heman, Calcol, which could be Chalcol, which will also be known at a later time as the Athenian or Grecian Cecrops, and Dara. And if you have a Bible like mine, the margin says Darda. Very important. This reference, especially to Dara, Darda, is not the same as Dan. This is tribe of Judah, and they have their role in history to play, and tribe of Dan, Danoi, Danos, different people. Claro? Okay, if you're not sure, please take the time to look at this because it will make so much confusion that you won't be able to sort anything out. Now, we know, by the way, this is all dealing with the line that came out of the loins of Jacob, who is Israel. But if you remember what I just said, to Judah is given the right to rule, the scepter, lawmaking. Until Shiloh comes, until Jesus returns, it's basically like that tribe is holding steady. And this is why this ties into the monarchy of today. Who knows what will happen? But I'm just telling you, the right to rule was given to Judah. Dan will have some similar character traits. They may even, in their tribal structure, they will set up their own kings, but they're not the kings that we're going to look at out of Judah. So don't get these confused. The Dara, Dardanus, whatever you want to call it, will be the line. This line out of 1 Chronicles 2nd and verse 6, the Dara or the Darda. That line will be the line that will eventually end up in what is called Troy. And that city, which was once believed to be mythological, of course, we know was dug up by the likes of Schliemann and others who basically unearthed and found, of course, at a later time, we corrected where exactly the city of Troy is. And then, of course, that opened the door to understand that this was not mythology, but an actual place with artifacts dating, as I said, the earth does not lie. And we know even within the period, unfortunately, earlier digs destroyed some of that area out of, I believe, giddiness and ignorance. But the studies are conclusive there. So we will follow the people out of the tribe of Judah eventually, not today, who will make their way to Troy, and a battle will ensue, and then these people will take off from there, and they will end up founding New Troy, which will be Brutus landing on what will eventually become England, and a whole line of kings that will come from that line. But that is not the tribe of Dan, so I don't want people getting this conflated. The Danoi had several waves of migration, and we know this now definitively. So not just perhaps one exodus prior to the exodus out of Egypt before they went into bondage. There's good reason to believe that there were, in fact, multiple exoduses, and I will explain that perhaps at a later time. But then we also have good reason to believe not only did Dan take off on sea primarily, but if from what we read in this biblical record and the little breadcrumbs that we can glean, we also have Dan who will also be by land eventually. It will be a much smaller portion of those people, and we will follow their trail. But Dan will pop up first and foremost. Remember, as the legend or the myth goes, that Danos fled Egypt with his 50 daughters. That's the legend. And essentially stopped in Rhodes, did some votive worship, and then went on to Argos and the Argolid. And if you know some of the writings of antiquity, yes, it's the same, the nomenclature, Argonauts, right? And people say, oh, it's a great story. Well, we'll see if eventually, not today, we'll see if there's any credence to that story. But I guarantee you, as we start looking for evidence, you begin to see clearly. For example, historians such as Will Durant, in his book, and I took the liberty to quote. I would have brought books, but I think there's just too much to start quoting here. So Will Durant, Life of Greece, page 72. The Argives ascribed the foundation of their city to the Pelasgic Argus, but the first flourishing to an Egyptian named Danos, who came at the head of the band of the Danae and taught the natives to irrigate their fields with wells. Now, if you don't think there's a direct tie-in to the people, think about Isaac and the wells, right? If you don't think there's a tie-in there, I can't fix it for you. It's there. These are the same people. Diodorus Siculus wrote, they say that those that set forth from Danos likewise from Egypt settled in what is practically the oldest known city of Greece. So there's enough breadcrumbs to follow the tribe of Dan and to realize they took off. And if we're just talking about perhaps those by sea, we know that before they got to where they went, there's another band that pops up in Cyprus. Their name is the Yadnana on the Isle of Dana. They like to leave names everywhere. I think that's kind of like, I love myself, I will leave a name. I love myself, I will leave a name. Yes? Luwian, Luwian, was a people, also a language. And the Luwian inscription discovered in Turkey attesting to the existence of a Danunian kingdom or a body of people bearing that name. So there are too many references to just go, okay, this is fanciful thinking. And as I keep compiling the evidence more and more, remember, I'm trying to do this for a broad audience. If you really want to dig deep and roll up your sleeves, I could probably make this so intense because there's so much overwhelming evidence. But if you look at the Tellermana letters, even there it mentions a place called Danuna. So, what do we know? Let me circle back to the Argos, the first city of Danae, as well as the connection to Mycenaean and people called Tyrans. Now, this is important because if you look up the history, bear with me, of the Mycenaean people, nobody really wants to tell you where they came from. And there's a lot of speculation out there. I told you my take that the Mycenaean people probably were a group of people, a combination, a conglomerate of people that had a certain hairstyle, the mushroom hairstyle. Remember that reference I made to a statue found representing biblical Joseph with the mushroom. And Mycenae, that if you look up the Greek word for mushroom, it's plausible. Other people have translated the word back into Hebrew and made it a Hebrew word, which it is, and has and connotes a certain meaning, not meaning mushroom, but to herd. There's several, because of the ambiguity of Hebrew, there's several different meanings there, but I don't really care what you want to do with that. These people were advanced, an advanced civilization. They had linguistic advancements, they had technological advancements. And you know, when you watch, sometimes you watch programs on TV and they say this ancient culture that was so advanced, maybe they were aliens. I'm not saying that they were, but they received information from somewhere else, because it's impossible to have the type of knowledge that they had. Now, the reason why I point this out is because there's going to be a cluster of people converging in the area we call Argos or Argolid. And during the Trojan Wars, which is a ways away, during the muddle and confusion, these people that are inhabiting this area, some of them are going to flee. They're going to take off. They are actually still worried that the Assyrians are coming after them. Even though they don't really know who they are by this time, they still know that's the enemy. They flee. They eventually come back and they reclaim their land, and we will see out of this, once they come back, two distinct groups will now really emerge, the land and sea people of Dan. So for now, we're going to focus, as I said, on the sea people. And what we learn is kind of staggering. From Keating's writings, who, if you're familiar with Keating's history, he said that these Danans would eventually make their way to Denmark and to Ireland. And now let me give you the reverse of that from another historical record. And this record is called the Annals of, I hope I say this right, Clonomachnois, which is the earliest record of Ireland from its beginnings to around 1408 AD. Here it says, and I will explain as well, upon them, Firbolgs, I'm sure that's probably not a proper way to pronounce it, came the people called the Tuatha de Danann, the tribe of Danann, out of Greece. Being a branch of the same stock of the Firbolgs, were of and kinsmen during the time that these people reigned in Assyria. During the space there were 3 monarchs. So they're describing a period of time. And just to be clear, Tuatha is not applied to only Dan. There were many Tuathas, many tribes that settled in the land of Ireland. The Tuatha de Danann is the tribe of Dan. They referred to each tribe as Tuatha of something. We have been conditioned to think this is just a nomenclature that's attached to Dan, but it was attached to any tribe, and then you put your name at the end. So we know what happened. There was a great meeting between these 2 clans, these 2 tribes, which were kinsmen, and it's said that in the space of this war that took place, 100,000 men were slain. That's a huge amount of people, even for that day and age, which included, by the way, their king. And these people who were already in the land, there's some interesting history on them, but hold that thought. Everything is hold that thought, because everything builds on something else, and you go, oh, okay, that makes sense with that. The question is, how do we know that this is real? How do we know that these people actually were in Ireland? How can we confirm this? Well, we have archaeological evidence, we've got biblical evidence, we've got historical writers, but there's something really great. Genome sequencing, DNA. This was performed at Trinity University in Dublin and Queen's University, and it reveals something out of this world. Not really. They analyzed the remains of a 5,200-year-old Irish farmer that revealed, through this, 2 waves of migration to the island in the past millennia, and their findings of this analysis reveal that the population of Ireland was closely related to other populations of Europe, but especially of Spain and Sardinia. The ancestry behind these people migrated from the Middle East. That's from the scientific world. This is not somebody who's a Bible believer. This was analyzed by outside sources as well. Another study examined the remains of 3 men from approximately 4,000 years ago, Bronze Age. This reveals another migration. This time, this shows you these 3,000-year-old, 4,000-year-old remains came from Eastern Europe and had traces from the Russian steppes. That proves to you that we have land. Those were the land people that mingled with other people that you can start sorting out who they mated with. And it becomes obvious that these are people that came by land and ended up in Ireland, and the ones that came by sea. So very clearly, as you begin to analyze the DNA, and then, of course, if time permitted, I could stand here and tell you about the vast archaeological discoveries, which are too many. There are so many that it's overwhelming. In your own time, please take the time to investigate if you'd like to do so. From one of the oldest texts coming out of Ireland, Leabar Gabla, I'm sure I'm not pronouncing that right either, or the Book of Invasions, as I'd prefer to refer to it as, much easier to pronounce, gives insight into what the settlers who came from what we call today Spain, that settled in Ireland. Now, let me take multiple steps back. Remember, I just was telling you about how the Phoenicians had established many different areas, but specifically that hub of Cadiz. And that area, basically, that is the last earth link, if you will. It would be the most plausible place for any person traversing the rough seas to stop before continuing on. So there's no doubt, again, I want you to think tribally, that these people would have stopped there, would have undoubtedly, some would have stayed, some would have found people to mate with, which describes why the DNA is commingled. We can trace this unequivocally. And as I said, there's a lot of interesting facts around Spain, which in antiquity bore a different name. You've heard of Iberia, bore a different name, and that name we know came from, trace back all of the areas around there, Ibero, the Hebrides, all coming from the name Heber, which is the name referring to the Hebrews. So we have so many threads being attached. I'm sorry, but at some point when you start to trace biblical names and you start to trace all of these breadcrumbs, and we're talking about not something very, oh, it's a random one here, but so many of these. And then you've got the archaeological digs specifically at Cadiz. That's the one that I focused on because it's got the most information. We have absolute reason to believe that these folks stopped there on their way. There's a commingling, of course, with the Phoenician people. There's probably a peppering of Philistine people, but you've got it all peppered in, and then once they take off from that area, and if you understand the geographical difficulties, they would have to stop there. So I'm showing you what I call the breadcrumbs. There's also good reason to believe, by the way, some have attached the place called Cadiz. They have attached it to the tribe of Gad. We will investigate that eventually because the people to this day are called Gaditanos. Gaditanos, with a G, G-A-D. So there's good reason to believe there's a possible connection there. Who knows? Maybe, right? Wink, wink, wink. But all this is also going to be important for us to understand because there will be a massive war that will take place, the Punic Wars, and when Carthage and the territory assigned geographically to Carthage, with that demise, there's going to be another wave of people that we're going to see emerge. So all of these, what I call breadcrumbs, add to we'll call it the depth, to see that we're looking at a people who, unbelievably, if you start looking at, as I said, the places, Eberni, Hibernia, Iverni, Aaron, the Hebrides, and you start making this connection, not only that, but you see the names of the tribe being peppered, and I'll refer to those shortly, but it's impossible that you wouldn't recognize and see these people spread their name as far as these shores, the Danube, the Dniester, the Dniester, the Dnapris, Road Dan, which is the Rhone, Danzig, Denmark, which was Denmark, the mark of Dan, Doncaster, Sardinia. Don't think of DN, don't think vowels, that's the way it would have been known in Hebrew or even in Phoenician. 2 consonants, no vowels, fill in the blanks. Dundalk, Scandinavia, London, Londonderry, Dingle, Dungarvan. The list goes on and on and on of how they deposited their names. And then, of course, I could keep going on that, but I think you get the idea. So at each of these places where they put their name, some established their tribal residence, some spread out, some had to keep migrating. And it becomes very obvious. Remember, I said separate Judah and Dan, but they somehow end up in the same area. Whereas we know that those people from Judah that ended up first in Troy and then ended up founding New Troy, that's Brutus who ends up founding New Troy that becomes England later, they will equally end up landing, these tribe of Judah people will equally end up landing shortly after, years after, the tribe of Dan, the Tuatha De Danann, lands in Ireland. The Milesians will show up. And again, don't think it's an accident that Judah and Dan are always somehow in this connected realm. They have traveled as separate and distinct. They share the common father and the common seed, Israel. But if you think that's some error, think twice. And if you begin to study the history of the peoples landing in Ireland, there are basically 5 groups, 5 tribes, 5 major tribes that landed in Ireland. And the first one is interesting. If you remember several messages back, I mentioned the Newton stone with the mention of a Partalion. Well, the first clan that settles Ireland, or settles in Ireland and establishes itself, is the clan belonging to one Partalion. And we know that they came by way of Spain. Again, they all had to come that way. Or even if they traveled over land, at some point you've got to travel to get there. There's no way to get across. Eventually you have to come by sea. So we have first this group of people, which if you read their history, it says they originated in Greece. Think about that. The second group of people, which are the Numidians, about 130 years after the first group, these people also came by way of Spain. The next group, about 270 years later, the Furbolg group, and they are connected, they are common ancestors, again, back to this common stock. The fourth tribe coming would be the Tuatha De Danann, the tribe of Dan, and the last one to come would be the clan Namil, or the Milesians. So you begin to see this history. Now, if you want to do this in reverse, look at Ireland's most recent history, say the last 200, 300, 400 years. I know that's not that recent for most, and work your way backward and see what you find. And you're going to be hard-pressed because, again, we're going to encounter a lot of mythology and a lot of lore. And I told you, you always have to go back and sort out between these things. Now, if you go to the writing of Saxo, I believe his last name is Grammaticus, who was a historian of about the 1200s, and he wrote the history of the Danes. And within that, he himself says, and remember, he says he was using older source material, and he states the material, and he says, this Tuatha De Danann is none other than the Danans and the tribe of Dan heralding from the house of Israel. So it's important for us to keep digging these details out. I just gave you a really, when I say a very generic overview, because I would like to spend the time to look at what happens from the Danans and the Argolid, that whole, maybe we can piece together a little bit of the history and figure out what happened. I'm not interested in getting to the micro details, but I want to show a little bit of that history to then show a complete migration so we can wrap our minds around this. And don't think that Dan will end up, that this is the terminus. They end in Ireland. We know, we have very good evidence to know that that's not the terminus. But if we're going to talk about archaeology, if we're going to talk about DNA, if we're going to talk about things that can substantiate and confirm what I'm talking about, the evidence is there. And I feel sorry for people who can't look at this and see not only God's hand. When God said, he foretold, he said, I will scatter them. And if you can't see the amount, the volume of people being as numerous that you can't even count, figure this out real quickly. And then step back from all this and say, maybe the history that we have been exposed to, I'm not saying it's all wrong, but maybe inconveniently we have not probed the depth and taken the time to pierce through some of these legendary tales that reveal something quite staggering. I am not saying that all the peoples on the face of the earth from the beginning of time are lost tribes. I'm not insinuating that. Because we know in the Table of Nations there were people in existence that weren't part of the people that God chose to focus on. We know that there are other people, for example, that are key players. They have nothing to do with the tribes of Israel, but they're key players along the way. The Hittites, the Mitanni people, all of these people in antiquity were either helpers to the tribes, like I said, the Phoenicians and the Philistines, which you maybe not connect the dots immediately, but then you start recognizing that somehow this all comes together, and the people we're focusing on perhaps may be the people eventually that in the end days, as I said, when the preachers of righteousness are called to preach and to declare basically the last clarion call on earth for people to respond, it may be that these people, whether they know it or not, whether they are enlightened in this day and age or not, may or may not respond because somebody took the time, and I said, I'm not the first to do this, but somebody took the time along the way to put out the call to say, consider that you may herald from somewhere else. And that origin does not mean, lost tribes does not mean, as people have erroneously done, well, that means you're a Jew. No, that does not mean that. I cannot repeat that enough. It means part of the whole of Israel that, by the way, looks nothing like the Israel of today. And this is why I said, and I will keep saying this, right now, Israel is kind of the state of Israel, the place we call Israel in today's world, is nothing but a placeholder until the time. Because the people, not all the people, but a lot of the people who inhabit that land converted to Judaism at a much later time. Most of them do not herald from the tribe of Judah if we tested and took their blood. And even in DNA tests where people attach the nomenclature of, for example, somebody has a test done and it says Ashkenazi Jew, that is an erroneous label. And you might say, well, how could that be? Well, keep looking at this information, keep probing, and you'll find deep enough, and there's nothing wrong with people converting to a faith. I'm not anti-anything on that wise. I'm simply saying, do not lump the true root of Judah together with people who are add-ons at a later time and do not share the bloodline or the DNA of that specific line that can only be called Judahite in our modern terms, Jew. And don't think this is an anti-Semite talk by any means, because it's simply putting out the facts. There are people who are walking this earth who actually believe they come from a certain lineage. And even in clarity, if you put this right in front of them and said, this is what it is, they still would say no, because somebody told them in their line, in their family tree. Forget about, as I said, doing a DNA test. I'm not recommending, don't rush out and do that, please. Your information is stored and probably will be used against you in a day when you are unaware of it. Trust me, even as a law-abiding citizen. That's my advice to you, by the way, and you could say, well, that's crazy, but I'd rather be safe than sorry. But what I am saying to you is consider this, one last thought. It took the tribe of Judah and the tribe of Dan to establish themselves in lands that eventually would become the lands of Ephraim and Manasseh. And you tell me that God didn't have a hand in guiding all this. We still have to look at the Celtic culture. We need to look at the people who will eventually come out of this mess as Danes, as Angles, as Jutes, who form the foundation, those Germanic tribes of what will become England. We still need to look at the people who are of interest to me specifically because I've seen enough and put enough together here to know that people have a very bad understanding of just who the Vikings were and why they are important. There's a whole bunch of information here that once you start peeling it back, you realize you can engage in, as I said, lore and legend, or you can pierce through that to find the kernel of truth, to recognize that God had a hand in all of this dispersion, and he will have a hand, much like he did at the Tower of Babel, in scattering. He will have a hand in gathering in the last days, and this all becomes an important part of that gathering. So I hope you will come back and listen to the next installment of what we're doing here, but in the meantime, that's my message. I'm Pastor Melissa Scott, pastor of Faith Center, Glendale, California. I teach every Sunday morning at 11 a.m. If you'd like to attend services with us, simply call the 800 number, that is 800-338-3030, to join us. If you'd like to watch, listen, and learn 24 hours a day, simply log on to our website at www.pastormelissascott.com.